They told her Americans were demons who would show no mercy to the defeated. But when Keiko Tanaka stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco Bay on a freezing November morning in 1945, shivering in her thin cotton uniform, a young American guard did something that would change her life forever. He removed his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, confused, trembling. He simply nodded and walked away into the cold. In that moment, everything she had been taught about the enemy began to crumble. If you've ever wondered about the untold human stories behind the statistics of World War II, the moments that couldn't be captured in history books or official records, then this story is for you. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because we're diving deep into one of the most remarkable love stories to emerge from the ashes of war. A story of unexpected kindness, forbidden feelings, and the courage to see humanity in the enemy. The summer of 1945 had been a nightmare that Keiko could never forget. She was 23 years old, working as a communications officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Intelligence Division in Tokyo. Her job was to decode messages, type reports, and maintain radio equipment. It was prestigious work for a woman in wartime Japan, and her family had been proud. But that pride turned to ash along with everything else. The firebombing campaigns had turned Tokyo into a wasteland of charred wood and twisted metal. Night after night, the sky lit up with orange flames as American B-29 bombers dropped their payloads across the city. Keiko remembered running through streets where the heat was so intense it felt like her lungs were burning from the inside. She remembered the screams, the smell of smoke and death, the way the ground shook with each explosion. Then came August. First Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The word spread through the military installations like wildfire. Atomic bombs, unimaginable destruction, tens of thousands dead in an instant. Keiko had sat in her small office, staring at the decoded messages coming through, unable to process what she was reading. How could such a weapon exist? How could one bomb destroy an entire city? On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing the surrender. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. Keiko sat with dozens of other women in the communications room, listening to words that seemed impossible to comprehend. Japan had never lost a war. The concept of surrender was foreign, shameful, devastating. Some of the women wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. A few of the older officers drew their service pistols, though their superiors quickly intervened. Keiko felt numb. Everything she had believed about her nation's invincibility, about the righteousness of their cause, about the weakness of the enemy, all of it shattered in the span of that brief radio address. The weeks that followed were chaos. American forces began occupying Japan, their ships filling the harbors, their planes circling overhead. The military infrastructure collapsed. Orders became contradictory, then stopped coming altogether. Keiko and the other women in her unit waited in their barracks, uncertain of their fate. They had all heard the stories, the propaganda that had filled their training. Americans were barbarians, they were told. They would rape the women, torture prisoners, show no honor or mercy. The military instructors had been very clear. Capture by the Americans meant a fate worse than death. Better to die with honor than suffer such degradation. So when American MPs arrived at their facility in late September with orders to round up military personnel for processing, Keiko's hands shook as she packed her small bag. She owned almost nothing: a spare uniform, a few personal items, a photograph of her family taken before the war. Her mother, father, and younger brother. She didn't know if they were still alive. Communication with her hometown had been cut off for months. The processing center was a converted factory on the outskirts of Tokyo. Hundreds of Japanese military personnel, mostly women from auxiliary units, were gathered there under American guard. The atmosphere was tense, filled with whispered conversations and barely suppressed fear. Keiko watched the American soldiers carefully. They were tall, most of them, with strange faces and incomprehensible language. They shouted orders in English that Japanese translators tried to convey. The women were separated into groups, photographed, fingerprinted, and given identification tags. But something was different from what Keiko had expected. The Americans were organized, methodical, but not cruel. They didn't beat anyone. They didn't drag women away screaming. When one older woman collapsed from exhaustion, an American medic rushed to help her, checking her pulse and giving her water. Keiko didn't know what to make of it. Perhaps the cruelty would come later, she thought. Perhaps this was just for show. After 3 days of processing, they were told they would be transported to America. The word sent a wave of shock through the crowded room. America? Why would they take Japanese prisoners all the way to America? What did they want with them? The rumors started immediately. Some said they would be used as slave labor. Others whispered about medical experiments. Everyone had heard about what had happened to American prisoners in Japanese camps, and surely the Americans would want revenge. A few clung to hope that this was simply bureaucracy, that they would eventually be released. Keiko tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever was coming. She thought of her family, of her mother's face the last time she'd seen her. She thought of cherry blossoms in spring, of the small garden behind her childhood home, of all the things she might never see again. She made a promise to herself. Whatever happened, she would survive. She would find a way to return home someday. The ship was a converted military transport, its cargo holds refitted with bunks for prisoners. Keiko and about 200 other Japanese women were loaded aboard in early October 1945. They were given blankets, assigned bunks, and told the journey would take approximately 2 weeks. The Pacific Ocean was rough that autumn. The ship rolled and pitched with the waves, and seasickness gripped most of the women within the first 2 days. Keiko spent hours lying in her bunk, trying not to vomit, listening to the sound of other women retching into buckets. But there were strange mercies here, too. American sailors brought water regularly, handed out crackers to settle stomachs, and even provided medicine for the worst cases. The food was simple but regular: rice, bread, canned vegetables, sometimes meat. It was more food than Keiko had seen in months. During the final year of the war, rations in Tokyo had dwindled to almost nothing. People survived on sweet potatoes and whatever they could scavenge. Keiko was suspicious of the food at first. She ate sparingly, watching for signs of poison or sickness. But days passed and nothing happened except that her strength began to return. Her sunken cheeks filled out slightly. The constant gnawing hunger she'd lived with for so long began to ease. At night, lying in her bunk, listening to the engines rumble and the ocean's roar, Keiko tried to imagine what America would be like. She had seen propaganda images during the war. American cities presented as decadent, corrupt, weak. But those cities had defeated Japan. Those weak Americans had built weapons that could destroy cities in a flash of light. Nothing made sense anymore. She talked sometimes with the other women, sharing whispered conversations in the dark. Most were terrified. Some cried every night. A few tried to maintain their military discipline, keeping their uniforms neat, standing at attention when Americans passed. But everyone was lost, adrift, severed from everything they'd known. One woman, Sachiko, who had worked in the same communications unit, became Keiko's closest companion. They lay in adjacent bunks and talked about their families, their lives before the war, their fears about what was coming. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Sachiko asked one night. Keiko had no answer. Home felt like a dream, distant and unreachable. As the ship pushed eastward across the Pacific, Keiko tried to steel herself for whatever lay ahead. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when America's coast finally appeared on the horizon. The first thing Keiko saw of America was the Golden Gate Bridge emerging from the morning fog. She stood on deck with the other women, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at the massive red structure spanning the bay. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a symbol of the nation that had defeated hers. It was November 3rd, 1945, and San Francisco Bay was bitterly cold. The wind cut through Keiko's thin cotton uniform like knives. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering as the ship maneuvered toward the dock. Around her, other women huddled together for warmth, their breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The ship docked with a shudder that ran through the hull. Orders were shouted in English. American sailors moved efficiently, securing lines, lowering gangways. Keiko and the others were told to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark. As she picked up her small bag, Keiko's legs felt weak. This was it. This was the moment when she would step onto enemy soil, into the unknown, into whatever fate awaited her. She thought of her mother's face one more time, whispered a silent prayer to ancestors she wasn't sure were listening, and joined the line of women shuffling toward the gangway. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped onto the open deck. November in San Francisco was nothing like Tokyo. The wind whipped across the bay, carrying the sharp smell of salt water and diesel fuel. Keiko had never experienced cold like this. Her uniform, designed for Tokyo's milder climate, offered almost no protection. She descended the gangway carefully, her numb fingers gripping the rope railing. At the bottom, American military personnel waited, directing the women toward a line of buses. MPs stood at intervals, watching, their faces unreadable beneath their helmets. That's when it happened. Keiko was standing in line, waiting to board the bus, shivering so hard she could barely stand. Her whole body shook. Her fingers had gone numb. She tried to wrap her arms around herself, but it did nothing to stop the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. An American guard stood nearby, young, maybe 25, with brown hair visible beneath his helmet and kind eyes that seemed out of place on a soldier's face. Keiko had noticed him because he wasn't like the others. While the other guards maintained strict professional distance, this one seemed to actually see the women as people. When one woman stumbled, he'd steadied her arm. When another dropped her bag, he'd picked it up for her. Now he was watching Keiko shiver, and she saw something flicker across his face. Concern, maybe even pity. She tried to stop shaking, tried to stand straighter, to show some dignity, but her body wouldn't obey. The guard looked around, checking if his superiors were watching. Then, in a movement so quick and casual it might have been accidental, he shrugged off his military jacket and stepped toward her. Keiko's eyes widened in shock as he draped the heavy olive-green jacket over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. The jacket smelled of wool and something else. Soap, maybe, and a scent she couldn't identify, but that felt somehow safe. She looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his blue ones. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. What could she say? She didn't speak English. She didn't understand why he would do this. He gave her a small nod, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then he stepped back to his post, now wearing only his uniform shirt in the freezing cold. Keiko stood frozen, not from cold now, but from shock. Her mind raced. This didn't make sense. He was the enemy. She was his prisoner. Why would he give her his jacket? Why would he make himself suffer to ease her discomfort? Around her, other women had noticed. Some stared in disbelief. One whispered something Keiko couldn't hear. But Keiko barely noticed them. She was still looking at the guard, watching as he stood in the cold, his arms crossed against his chest, his breath visible in the freezing air. For the first time since the surrender, something stirred in Keiko's chest that wasn't fear or despair. It was confusion, certainly, but also something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. She clutched the jacket tighter around her shoulders as the line began to move toward the buses. The warmth seeped into her skin, her muscles, her very core. But it was more than physical warmth. Something inside her, something that had frozen solid during the long nightmare of defeat and uncertainty, began to thaw. As she climbed onto the bus, she looked back one more time. The guard was still standing there, still in just his shirt, watching to make sure all the women boarded safely. Their eyes met again for just a second before the bus door closed. Keiko didn't know it yet, but that brief moment, that simple act of unexpected kindness, had planted a seed that would grow into something neither of them could have anticipated. In a world torn apart by hate and war, in the frozen morning air of San Francisco Bay, something impossible had just begun. The bus journey took 2 days, traveling south and east through landscapes Keiko had never imagined. She kept the guard's jacket wrapped around her, though the other women had been given blankets. She told herself it was just because the jacket was warmer, but in quiet moments she admitted the truth. The jacket meant something to her. It was proof that kindness could exist in impossible places. They arrived at Camp Florence in Arizona on a gray November afternoon. The camp sat in the desert, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, rows of wooden barracks stretching across the sand. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the pale sky. Keiko and the other women were processed again, photographed, issued uniforms, assigned barracks numbers. The camp held about 300 Japanese prisoners, mostly women who had served in various military capacities. Some had been nurses, others communication specialists like Keiko, still others had worked in administration or logistics. The barracks were simple but clean, rows of metal bunks, a pot-bellied stove in the center for heat, small windows that let in the desert light. Keiko was assigned a lower bunk near the back. She carefully folded the guard's jacket and placed it at the foot of her bed, uncertain what to do with it. That first night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar camp in this unfamiliar country, Keiko couldn't sleep. The desert was cold at night in a different way than San Francisco, dry and sharp rather than damp and cutting. She could hear other women crying softly in the darkness, homesick, scared, mourning everything they'd lost. But Keiko's mind kept returning to the moment on the dock. The guard's face. The way he'd moved so quickly as if to help before he could think better of it. The warmth of his jacket. The brief connection when their eyes met. She didn't even know his name. Life in Camp Florence quickly fell into a pattern. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bell. Breakfast in the mess hall, coffee, toast, sometimes eggs or oatmeal. Work assignments followed. Some women worked in the camp laundry, others in the kitchen or administrative offices. Keiko, because of her English education in school and her communication background, was assigned to help in the camp library, organizing books and helping translate simple documents. The work was light, almost absurdly so compared to the grueling conditions of wartime Japan. The American guards were professional but not cruel. The food was regular and abundant, more than Keiko had eaten in years. There were even small luxuries, a canteen where prisoners could buy chocolate or cigarettes with the small wages they earned, a recreation room with magazines and a radio, even a volleyball court. It was disorienting. This was captivity, but it didn't feel like punishment. It felt more like waiting. Waiting for the world to figure out what to do with them. Keiko tried to understand it. She talked with the other women, comparing experiences, trying to make sense of American behavior. Some women remained bitter and suspicious, convinced this kindness was temporary or strategic. Others began to relax, grateful simply to be alive and fed. But Keiko couldn't stop thinking about the jacket. She had tried to return it several times during the first week, folding it carefully and bringing it to the camp office, asking in broken English to give it back to the guard from San Francisco. But the staff seemed confused. They didn't know which guard she meant. There were dozens of guards, they told her. They rotated posts. Without a name, there was no way to identify him. So the jacket remained at the foot of her bunk, a reminder of a moment she couldn't explain or forget. 3 weeks passed. Keiko settled into the routine, learning more English, making a few friends among the other prisoners, trying not to think too much about home or the future. The desert winter was setting in, the nights growing colder, though nothing like that first morning in San Francisco. Then one afternoon in late November, everything changed. Keiko was walking back from the library to her barracks, her arms full of books for the women who wanted to practice their English. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. She wasn't paying much attention to where she was going, her mind occupied with conjugating English verbs. She almost walked directly into him. "Oh, sorry, I—" She started in English, then stopped, the words dying in her throat. It was him, the guard from the dock. She recognized his eyes first, that same kind expression that had seemed so out of place on a soldier. He was in full uniform now, his jacket firmly in place, but it was definitely him. He recognized her too. She saw it in the way his eyes widened slightly, in the small smile that touched his lips. "You," he said softly. Then, seeming to realize she might not understand, he pointed at her, then at himself, making a gesture that seemed to indicate their previous meeting. Keiko nodded frantically, nearly dropping her books. "Yes, you, the jacket." She didn't know if she was making any sense, but she gestured toward her barracks, trying to convey that she had it, that she'd kept it. He seemed to understand. He held up one hand in a wait gesture, then pointed to himself and to the barracks, raising his eyebrows in question. "Could he come? Could he get the jacket back?" Keiko nodded again, her heart beating faster than made any sense. She led him toward the barracks, acutely aware of his presence behind her, of the curious looks from other prisoners they passed. At the barracks, she gestured for him to wait outside. Men weren't allowed in the women's quarters, except for official inspections. She hurried inside, grabbed the jacket from her bunk, and rushed back out. He was standing exactly where she'd left him, looking slightly awkward, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal, at-ease position. When she emerged with the jacket, his face brightened. "Thank you," he said clearly, taking the jacket. Then more slowly. "Are you warm enough now?" Keiko caught maybe half the words, but she understood the meaning. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself in an exaggerated gesture of warmth, then pointing to her army-issue coat. He smiled, a real smile this time, not just the ghost of one. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less like a soldier and more like a regular person. "Good," he said. Then he did something unexpected. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "James. My name is James." Keiko's eyes widened. He was telling her his name. Why would he do that? Guards didn't tell prisoners their names. It was too personal, too human. But he stood there waiting, expectant, and Keiko realized he wanted to know her name too. "Keiko," she said softly, pointing to herself. "I am. Keiko." "Keiko," he repeated, and something about hearing her name in his accent, in his voice, made her breath catch. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. Around them, the camp continued its routine. Women walking to dinner, guards making rounds, the distant sound of a radio playing American music. But in that moment, Keiko felt like they were in their own small world. James seemed to realize he was lingering too long. He straightened, gave her a small nod that was almost a bow, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her culture, and then walked away, his jacket folded over his arm. Keiko stood watching him go until he disappeared around a corner. Then she turned and found Sachiko standing in the barracks doorway, her eyes wide. "Keiko-san," Sachiko whispered in Japanese. "That's dangerous. You shouldn't talk to the guards." "I know," Keiko replied. But even as she said it, she knew it was already too late for such warnings. Something had begun, something she didn't fully understand but couldn't seem to stop. After that day, Keiko started seeing James everywhere. It wasn't that he sought her out, or at least he was subtle about it if he did, but their paths seemed to cross with increasing frequency. He'd be on duty when she walked to the library, he'd be at the fence line when she took her evening walk around the camp perimeter. He'd be checking passes at the mess hall when she went to dinner. Each time they saw each other, there was a moment of recognition. A small nod, a brief smile. Nothing that would draw attention or seem inappropriate. But each small interaction felt significant to Keiko, like drops of water slowly filling a cup. She tried to tell herself it meant nothing. He was just being kind, the way he'd been kind on the dock. He probably didn't think about her at all outside of these brief encounters. She was a prisoner, after all. He was her guard. There was an unbridgeable gulf between them. But then little things happened that made her question those assumptions. One evening in early December, Keiko was returning from the library when she noticed something on her bunk. It was a book, a small English-Japanese dictionary, well used but in good condition. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but somehow Keiko knew. She picked up the dictionary with trembling hands, flipping through its pages. Someone had marked certain entries with small pencil dots. She looked them up. "Hello. How are you?" "Thank you." "Friend." Her breath caught. Friend. He wanted to be friends. Another time, during a particularly cold week in December, an extra blanket appeared on her bunk. Again, no note, no explanation. But when Keiko saw James the next day, he glanced at her and raised his eyebrows slightly, a question. She nodded and mouthed thank you, and his smile was answer enough. The other women in her barracks noticed, of course. Some were disapproving, warning Keiko that she was being foolish, that Americans couldn't be trusted, that she was courting danger. Others were more pragmatic, suggesting she should use any advantage she could to make life more comfortable. But Sachiko understood what was really happening. "You like him," she said one night, her voice soft in the darkness. Keiko wanted to deny it, should deny it, but lying to Sachiko seemed pointless. "I don't know," she whispered back. "He's different. Kind. I didn't expect—" "He's the enemy," Sachiko reminded her gently. "Is he?" Keiko asked, "or was he? The war is over. We lost. What does enemy even mean now?" Sachiko had no answer. No part. Christmas came to Camp Florence with decorations in the mess hall and special meals for the prisoners. The Americans seemed to take their holidays seriously. There was turkey, mashed potatoes, even pie. For the Japanese prisoners, it was strange and foreign, but most appreciated the gesture. Keiko was walking back from Christmas dinner when she heard someone call her name. "Keiko." She turned to find James standing a little way off, near the fence that separated the camp from the guard quarters. It was dusk, the desert sky fading from blue to purple, and the camp was quiet as most people were still at dinner. She walked over to him slowly, her heart racing. He was off duty, she noticed. No helmet, no weapon, just his uniform. "Merry Christmas," he said clearly, speaking slowly so she could understand. "Did you enjoy dinner?" Keiko nodded, searching for the English words she needed. "Yes, very good. Thank you." "You're welcome." He paused, seeming nervous. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small wrapped package. "I brought you something. For Christmas." Keiko stared at the package, then at him. "For me?" "For you," he confirmed, holding it out. She took it with shaking hands, unwrapping the paper carefully. Inside was a pair of gloves, wool, lined, warm, exactly what she needed for the cold desert nights. "James." She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly bright with tears she couldn't explain. Why you do this?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because you're cold. Because I want to help. Because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. Then more softly, "Because I see you, Keiko. Not prisoner, not enemy. I see you. Person, good person." Keiko understood maybe half the words, but she understood all the meaning. He wasn't just being generally kind. This was specific. This was about her. "I see you too," she said in careful English. "Good person. Kind heart." They stood there on opposite sides of the fence, holding each other's gaze in the fading light. It was the most dangerous and wonderful moment of Keiko's life. "I shouldn't," James said, more to himself than to her. "This is not allowed, not proper." "I know," Keiko replied in Japanese, then in English. "I know. But I can't help it," he continued. "Every time I see you, I want to make sure you're okay. I want to talk to you. I want to—" He stopped abruptly, shaking his head. "This is crazy." "Crazy," Keiko agreed, understanding that word. Then softer, "But maybe good crazy?" He laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Maybe. Maybe good crazy." Over the following weeks, they found ways to see each other, to talk. Brief conversations by the fence in the evening. Past notes hidden in books at the library where Keiko worked and James sometimes had duty. Stolen moments that grew longer and more meaningful with each passing day. Keiko's English improved rapidly, motivated by her desire to really communicate with James. She practiced constantly, studying her dictionary, listening carefully to the guards' conversations, asking the camp translator questions about pronunciation and grammar. James tried to learn some Japanese too, though he struggled more than she did with English. But Keiko found his attempts endearing. The way he carefully practiced the phrases she taught him, how he'd repeat them over and over to get the pronunciation right. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up on a farm in Iowa, about his mother who taught school, and his father who raised corn and hogs, about his younger sister who was studying to be a nurse, about how he'd joined the army right after Pearl Harbor, driven by anger and patriotism, and how that anger had slowly faded into something more complicated as the war dragged on. Keiko told him about Tokyo, about her family, about the beautiful garden she'd visited as a child, about studying English in school and dreaming of perhaps becoming a teacher herself. About the war years, though those were harder to discuss, the fear, the hunger, the bombs, about not knowing if her family was alive. "I'm sorry," James said when she told him about her family. "I'm so sorry for what happened. The bombs, the fire, all of it." "You were sorry?" Keiko looked at him in surprise. "You did not do it. My country did it. My people. And my country started war, Keiko replied quietly. My people did terrible things, too. I heard about what Japanese soldiers did in China, in Philippines. So much hurt, everywhere. They sat with that silence for a while, both of them grappling with the weight of it. Maybe that's why we need to find another way, James finally said. Maybe people like us, talking, seeing each other as human, maybe that's how we stop it from happening again. Maybe, Keiko agreed. But she wondered if it was really that simple. It was inevitable that they would be discovered. Looking back, Keiko was surprised they'd managed to keep it secret as long as they did. But in late January 1946, their luck ran out. One of the other guards, a sergeant named Morrison who had a reputation for being strict and by the book, saw James and Keiko talking by the fence one evening. Their conversation was innocent enough, but the way they looked at each other, the way they leaned close as if the fence wasn't there, made their feelings obvious. Morrison reported it immediately to the camp commander, Captain Richards. James was called into the commander's office the next morning. Keiko didn't see him for 3 days afterward, and she spent those days in an agony of worry and guilt. What had she done? Had she gotten him in serious trouble? Would he be punished because of her? When he finally appeared again, he looked tired and troubled. He found her in the library, making sure no other guards were around, and spoke quietly and urgently. They know, he said. About us. About whatever this is. Keiko's hands went to her mouth. Oh, no. James, I am so sorry. Don't, he interrupted. Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. It's both of us. What will happen? James rubbed his face. Richards gave me a choice. He could report me, which would mean a court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe military prison, or... He paused. Or I could request a transfer to another camp. Immediately. And never contact you again. Keiko felt like the floor had dropped away beneath her. Transfer? You must go? That's what I told him I'd do. It's the smart choice, the safe choice. He looked at her, his eyes full of something that made her heart ache. But Keiko, I don't want to go. I don't want to never see you again. I don't want that too, she whispered. But James, you must be safe. Your life, your family. I know all the logical reasons why I should just go. He stepped closer to the fence between them. But nothing about this is logical, is it? Nothing about the way I feel about you makes any sense. The way you... feel? Keiko's English was good enough now to understand, but she needed to hear him say it clearly. I'm falling in love with you, James said quietly. Maybe I have been since that morning on the dock when I saw you shivering. I know it's impossible. I know it's crazy. But I can't help it. Keiko felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I fall in love with you too, she managed in broken English. I try not to. I tell myself no, but my heart does not listen. They stood on opposite sides of the fence, both of them crying now, both of them caught between impossible feelings and impossible circumstances. What do we do? Keiko asked. I don't know, James admitted. Richards is giving me 2 weeks to decide. 2 weeks before I have to transfer or face court-martial. 2 weeks, Keiko repeated. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Those 2 weeks were the most intense of Keiko's life. She and James met whenever they could, talking for hours, trying to figure out if there was any possible future for them. The obstacles were enormous. He was American. She was Japanese. She was still technically a prisoner of war, with no clear path to freedom or citizenship. Even if the camp released her, where would she go? She had no money, no home, no way to support herself in this foreign country. An interracial marriage, especially between an American and a Japanese person so soon after the war, was unthinkable in most places. Illegal in some states. We could run away, James suggested one desperate evening. Just disappear. Go somewhere no one knows us. And how would we live? Keiko asked, though part of her wanted to say yes. You would be deserter. I would be... what? Escaped prisoner? We would always be running. I know, he admitted. I know it's stupid, but I can't stand the thought of losing you. Keiko took his hand through the fence. Maybe we must be patient. War is over. Someday things will change. Maybe someday. Someday is too long, James interrupted. I've already lost so much time to this war. I don't want to lose more. They went round and round discussing options, discarding them, getting frustrated, calming down, trying again. Sachiko tried to help, suggesting contacts who might assist with paperwork or finding Keiko a job outside the camp. Other prisoners offered advice, though some of it was contradictory. Meanwhile, the deadline approached. James grew increasingly tense, struggling with his decision. Stay and risk everything, or go and lose the only woman he'd ever truly loved. Keiko was torn too. Part of her wanted to tell him to go, to save himself, to not throw his life away for an impossible love. But another part, the part that had come alive when he draped his jacket over her shoulders on that freezing morning, wanted him to stay, wanted to fight for this feeling no matter how impossible it seemed. On the 13th day, something unexpected happened. Captain Richards called both of them to his office. Keiko was terrified as she walked across the camp, escorted by 2 guards. What if she was being punished? What if they were separating her and James immediately? But when she entered the office, Richards' expression was more thoughtful than angry. James was already there, standing at attention. Keiko was told to sit. "I've been thinking about your situation," Richards began, looking between them. "It's complicated, irregular, possibly the most irregular situation I've dealt with in 20 years of service." Neither Keiko nor James spoke. Richards continued. "Under normal circumstances, I would have simply transferred Private Morrison here and been done with it. The Army doesn't have time for romantic complications." "Sir," James started, but Richards held up a hand. "However," he said, "these aren't normal circumstances. The war is over. We're in a period of transition, reconciliation even, and I've been watching both of you." He looked at Keiko. "Miss Tanaka, you've been a model prisoner. You work hard, you follow rules, you help the other prisoners adjust. You've even been helping translate documents for the camp administration." Keiko nodded nervously. "And Morrison," Richards turned to James, "you're a good soldier, honorable, perhaps too honorable, given that you refuse to simply deny everything and save yourself." "I couldn't lie about it, sir," James said quietly. "No, you couldn't, which is part of why I'm willing to consider an alternative solution." Richards leaned back in his chair. "The camp is scheduled to begin releasing low-risk prisoners in the coming months. Miss Tanaka, given your record and the current climate of reconciliation, I could potentially expedite your release." Keiko's eyes widened. "Release? I can go free?" "With conditions," Richards clarified. "You'd need a sponsor, someone to vouch for you, provide employment, ensure you don't become a ward of the state. And you'd need to stay in the United States for at least 1 year while your case is reviewed." He looked at James. "I don't suppose you know anyone who might be willing to sponsor her?" James's face lit up with understanding. "Sir, There's more," Richards interrupted. "Morrison, you'd have to marry her. Right away. Before her release. That would make her your legal responsibility and give her the protection of your citizenship." He paused. "I'm offering you this option because I believe you're both sincere. But I need to be clear. This will not be easy. There will be prejudice, discrimination, hostility. Your families might disown you. Strangers might harass you. Some states won't even recognize your marriage as legal." "I don't care," James said immediately. "Sir, if you're giving us a chance, I'll take it. Whatever the cost." Richards looked at Keiko. "Miss Tanaka, do you understand what you'd be agreeing to? Marrying someone you've known for only a few months in a country that's not your own, facing discrimination and hardship?" Keiko thought of that morning on the dock. She thought of the warmth of James's jacket, the kindness in his eyes, the way he'd protected her when he had no reason to. She thought of all their conversations, all the moments they'd stolen, all the impossible feelings that had grown between them. "I understand," she said quietly. "And yes, I want this. I want to try." Richards nodded slowly. "Then I'll start the paperwork. But understand, this is highly irregular. I'm doing this because I believe in second chances and because I think you two might actually make it work. Don't make me regret it." "We won't, sir," James promised. "Thank you. Thank you so much." They were married 3 weeks later in a small chapel in the nearby town of Florence. The ceremony was simple: a local minister, Captain Richards as witness, Sachiko and a couple of other prisoners allowed to attend as Keiko's guests. Keiko wore a simple white dress that one of the camp secretaries had loaned her. James wore his dress uniform. They stood before the minister, holding hands, and spoke vows that felt both surreal and more real than anything in Keiko's life. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her. It was their first kiss, and Keiko felt it all the way to her toes. Not just the physical sensation, but the meaning of it. She was free. She was married. She had a future, improbable as it seemed. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the camp mess hall. Some of the guards and prisoners had pitched in to create something special. Cake made by the camp kitchen, flowers from the town, even a scratchy phonograph playing music. Sachiko hugged Keiko tightly. "I'm happy for you," she whispered in Japanese. "But I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," Keiko replied, tears in her eyes. "Write to me when you get home?" "I promise." That night, Keiko and James stayed in a small room that had been prepared for them in the married quarters on the base. It was tiny, just a bed, a chair, a small window, but to Keiko it felt like a palace. They lay together in the narrow bed, holding each other, still hardly believing this was real. Are you scared? James asked softly. Yes, Keiko admitted. But also, happy? Is that strange? No. He kissed her forehead. I'm scared too. And happy. Both at the same time. What happens now? Now we start our life together, James said. I've been thinking. My discharge papers should come through in a few months. We could go to California, maybe San Francisco. It's more open-minded there, more diverse. I could find work. You could too if you wanted. We could build something. San Francisco, Keiko repeated thoughtfully. Where we first met. Where I first saw you shivering in the cold and knew I had to help. Keiko smiled against his chest. I thought you were crazy. American soldier, giving jacket to enemy prisoner. I was crazy, James agreed. Crazy from the moment I saw you. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. James received his discharge in March 1946, and they immediately moved to San Francisco as planned. They found a small apartment in a neighborhood that had both a Japanese community and enough mixed cultures to be relatively accepting. It wasn't easy. Keiko had been right about the discrimination. Some landlords refused to rent to them. Some store owners served James but ignored Keiko. Children sometimes shouted slurs. Old men who'd lost sons in the Pacific Theater spat at their feet. But there were good moments, too. Neighbors who brought them food. A Japanese grocery store owner who gave Keiko a job. The way James's hand always found hers when they walked down the street, a silent message that they were in this together. Keiko wrote letters to Japan, trying to find her family. For months there was no response, and she feared the worst. Then finally, in August 1946, a letter arrived from her mother. They were alive, her parents and her brother, living in the ruins of Tokyo, but alive. Her mother's letter was full of shock at Keiko's marriage, concern for her well-being, but also a grudging acceptance. If he treats you well, her mother wrote, then perhaps something good can come from all this tragedy. James found work at a shipping company, using his military experience with the logistics. It didn't pay much, but it was enough for them to live on. Keiko worked at the grocery store and took English classes at night, determined to improve her skills. They made friends slowly. Other mixed couples, Japanese Americans who had returned from internment camps, progressive activists who believed in reconciliation and integration. It was a small community, but it was theirs. And every night, no matter how hard the day had been, they came home to each other. To the small apartment that was their refuge. To the love that had started with a jacket on a freezing dock and grown into something unshakable. 1 year after their wedding, Keiko and James went back to the San Francisco docks. It was a cold November morning, much like the morning they'd first met. They stood at the pier, watching ships come and go, remembering. Do you regret it? Keiko asked. Choosing this? Choosing me? James pulled her closer against the wind. Not for a second, do you? Keiko thought about it. She thought about everything she'd lost. Her country, in a sense. Her old life. The comfort of speaking her native language all the time. The familiarity of her own culture. But she also thought about what she'd gained. Freedom. Love. A future she'd never dared to imagine during the dark days of the war. A partner who saw her as an equal, who valued her mind as much as her heart. No, she said firmly. No regrets. Good. He kissed the top of her head. Because I plan to keep you for the rest of my life. Keiko Morrison. She smiled at her new name. It had taken some getting used to, but now it felt right. She was Keiko Morrison, neither purely Japanese nor purely American, but something new. Something forged in the aftermath of war, in the space between two worlds. They stood on that dock for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms against the cold. The same cold that had brought them together. The cold that had prompted a young soldier to give his jacket to a shivering enemy prisoner, changing both their lives forever. And as the sun broke through the fog, warming the bay, Keiko thought about that jacket. They still had it, folded carefully in a box in their closet. Sometimes she took it out and held it, remembering. Remembering the moment when she learned that kindness could exist even in the darkest times. That love could bridge impossible divides. That enemies could become friends, and friends could become family. The jacket had been warm, yes, but it was the gesture that had truly saved her. The simple human act of one person seeing another person suffering and choosing to help. In that moment, on that freezing dock, the war had truly ended for both of them. Everything that came after, the love, the marriage, the new life, it all flowed from that one choice. To give warmth when you could have given coldness. To see a person when you could have seen an enemy. To choose love when the whole world was choosing hate. Years later, long after the war had faded into history, Keiko and James would tell their story to their children and grandchildren. They'd bring out the jacket, yellowed now with age, and recount that freezing morning in November 1945. Your grandfather saw me shivering, Keiko would say in her accented but fluent English. And he didn't see a Japanese soldier. He didn't see an enemy. He just saw a cold person who needed help. And your grandmother, James would add, his hair white now but his eyes still kind, taught me that the labels we put on people Enemy, ally, foreign, familiar, those labels mean nothing compared to our shared humanity. Their children grew up understanding that love could transcend boundaries, that kindness could change lives, that the courage to see beyond differences was the greatest strength of all. And that jacket, carefully preserved, became a family heirloom. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can have the biggest impact. That giving your jacket to someone who's cold might just change the world. In the end, Keiko and James's story wasn't just about two people falling in love across impossible boundaries. It was about what becomes possible when we choose to see each other as human beings first, before all other labels. When we choose warmth over coldness, understanding over hatred, love over fear. It was about a jacket given on a freezing morning and all the warmth that flowed from that single moment of unexpected kindness. If you found this story meaningful, if it touched your heart, or made you think differently about love, kindness, and the power of seeing past our differences, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We share true stories from history that remind us of our shared humanity, stories that might not make it into the textbooks but that deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Because in a world that often seems determined to divide us, we need these reminders more than ever. We need to remember that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that kindness can thrive even in the aftermath of war, and that one simple gesture, like giving your jacket to someone who's cold, can ripple forward through generations. Thank you for watching, and remember, the choice to see someone's humanity, to offer warmth when you could offer coldness, to choose love when the world chooses hate, that choice is available to all of us, every single day. Make it count. The transition from prisoner to free woman was harder than Keiko had imagined. Even with James by her side, even with the legal protection of marriage, the reality of building a life in post-war America was overwhelming. Their first apartment was in the Fillmore district, in a building where the landlord was willing to overlook the unusual nature of their marriage in exchange for regular rent payments. The apartment consisted of 2 small rooms, a combined living space and bedroom, and a tiny kitchen with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The bathroom was shared with 3 other apartments on their floor. To Keiko, who had grown up in a traditional Japanese house with tatami mats and sliding doors, the Western-style apartment felt alien. Everything was hard surfaces, wooden floors, plaster walls, metal fixtures. There was no genkin where one could remove shoes, no ofuro for proper bathing, no space for the small household altar she'd grown up with. But there was heat, running water, and electricity that worked most of the time. After the deprivations of wartime Japan and the camp, these were luxuries she never took for granted. James tried to make it feel like home. He bought second-hand furniture from a thrift store, a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a radio. Keiko added her own touches. Curtains she sewed from fabric remnants, a small plant in the window, careful arrangements of their few possessions that reminded her of the Japanese aesthetic principle of ma, the beauty of empty space. Money was tight those first months. James's job at the shipping company paid $35 a week, which had to cover rent, food, utilities, and everything else. Keiko's work at the Japanese grocery store brought in another $15 weekly, paid in cash by Mr. Yamamoto, the owner who had himself spent the war years in an internment camp with his family. They learned to budget carefully. Monday was rice and vegetables. Tuesday was leftover rice made into fried rice. Wednesday, if they were lucky, there might be fish from the market. Thursday was often soup made from bones and whatever vegetables were cheapest. Friday, James got paid so they could afford a bit of meat. Saturday, they might splurge on a meal out. Nothing fancy, just noodles from a small restaurant in Chinatown. Sunday, Keiko cooked a bigger meal, something that would provide leftovers for the early part of the week. Keiko missed Japanese food desperately at first. Real miso soup, fresh sashimi, the rice dishes her mother used to make. But Mr. Yamamoto's store helped. She could buy miso paste, rice, pickled vegetables, dried seaweed. She learned to adapt, creating hybrid dishes that combine Japanese techniques with American ingredients. "What is this?" James asked one evening, looking at his plate with interest. "Hamburger donburi," Keiko said with a small smile. "Japanese rice bowl, but with American hamburger instead of chicken or beef." He took a bite and his face lit up. "This is delicious." Keiko felt a warm glow of pride. Finding ways to blend their two cultures to create something new that honored both, it felt like a small victory. The language barrier was harder than Keiko had expected, despite her years of English study. Academic English and everyday American English were very different things. She could read a newspaper article, but struggled with slang, idioms, and the rapid-fire conversations of native speakers. James was patient, but he couldn't be with her all the time. When she went to the market alone, or tried to take the streetcar, or needed to interact with their neighbors, she was on her own. Some people were kind, speaking slowly and clearly. Others grew impatient with her halting English, or simply ignored her. The worst were those who used her language difficulties to demean her. Once, at a department store, a saleswoman deliberately gave her wrong change and then mocked her when she tried to point out the error. "Maybe you should learn to count in American, sweetie," the woman said with a nasty smile. Keiko had stood there, her face burning with shame and anger, unable to find the English words to defend herself. She'd left the store close to tears, the wrong change still in her pocket because she didn't have the language skills to fight back. When she told James that evening, his face went dark with anger. "Which store? I'll go back there tomorrow and No," Keiko said firmly. "That makes it worse. Makes me look weak. Like I need you to fight my battles." "But she cheated you." "I know. But James, this is my life now. I must learn to handle these things myself." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he respected her decision. Instead, he spent the next several evenings helping her practice confrontational English, how to firmly insist on correct change, how to demand respect, how to stand up for herself without his protection. "You are not weak," he told her. "You survived a war. You crossed an ocean. You started a new life in a foreign country. That's the opposite of weak." His words helped, but Keiko still felt the sting of moments when her language skills failed her, when she couldn't quite express what she meant, when she had to watch herself being misunderstood or dismissed. The Japanese community in San Francisco became a refuge of sorts. At Mr. Yamamoto's store or at the small Buddhist temple in Japantown, she could speak her native language, could be understood completely. There she didn't have to struggle for words or worry about pronunciation. But even there, her situation was unusual. She was one of the few Japanese women who had married an American, and while some women were supportive, others were judgmental. "You married a Hakujin," one older woman said, using the Japanese word for white person with a slight tone of disdain. "How can you betray your people like that?" "I didn't betray anyone," Keiko replied quietly. "I fell in love. The war is over." "The war is never over," the woman said. "Not for us. We will always be different. Always be other. And you've made yourself even more other." Those words haunted Keiko. Was she betraying her heritage? Was she losing her Japanese identity by choosing this life with James? She talked about it with Sachiko in letters. Her friend had been repatriated to Japan and was living in Tokyo, trying to rebuild her life in the ruins. Sachiko's letters painted a bleak picture. Food shortages, destroyed buildings, the humiliation of occupation by American forces, the struggle to find work or housing. "But I am home," Sachiko wrote. "I am with my people, speaking my language, following my traditions." "Don't you miss that, Keiko-san?" Keiko did miss it. She missed it terribly. But when she looked at James, when she thought about the life they were building together, she knew she'd made the right choice. It wasn't about choosing America over Japan. It was about choosing love, choosing partnership, choosing a future that was uniquely hers. Sometimes the war felt very close, like the time they went to see a movie and the newsreel before the feature showed footage from the occupation of Japan. American soldiers standing in front of the Imperial Palace, Japanese citizens bowing to MacArthur, the humiliation of defeat displayed for all to see. Keiko had sat in the dark theater, tears streaming silently down her face, while James held her hand and whispered apologies she couldn't quite hear over the narrator's triumphant voice. Or the time a man at James's work found out he'd married a Japanese woman and called her the enemy within James's hearing. James had been sent home for the day after he punched the man. Keiko had been angry at him for losing his temper, but also touched that he'd defended her honor so fiercely. "You can't hit everyone who says something bad," she told him as she cleaned his split knuckles. "Maybe I can't hit everyone," James agreed, "but I can hit that one." Despite these difficulties, they persevered. James got a promotion at work, which meant a small raise. Keiko's English improved steadily, and Mr. Yamamoto began trusting her with more responsibilities at the store, including helping with bookkeeping. They saved a little money each week, dreaming of eventually being able to afford a better apartment, or maybe even a house someday. They made friends, slowly, carefully. Other mixed couples who understood their struggles. Progressive activists who believed in integration and equality. Japanese Americans who had come back from the internment camps and were trying to rebuild their lives. Liberal white neighbors who saw them as people first, rather than as symbols of the recent war. One of their closest friends became a couple named Robert and Mary Chen. He was Chinese American, she was white, and they'd faced many of the same challenges. The four of them would gather for potluck dinners, sharing food and stories and the comfort of being understood. "People look at us like we're making a political statement just by existing," Mary said one evening. "Like our marriages are about making some kind of point rather than just loving someone." "Yes," Keiko agreed fervently. "I did not marry James to make statement. I married him because he gave me his jacket when I was cold." Everyone laughed at that, and Keiko realized it had become her standard answer when people asked about their relationship. It was simple, true, and somehow captured everything that mattered about why they were together. As Keiko's English improved and she became more confident navigating American society, she began to think about what she wanted to do beyond just surviving. Working at the grocery store was fine, but she wanted something more. She remembered her dream of becoming a teacher. It seemed impossible now. She didn't have an American teaching credential, and she doubted any school would hire a Japanese woman so soon after the war. But maybe there were other ways to teach. She approached the director of the Buddhist temple, asking if she could offer Japanese language lessons to the children in the community. Many of them had been born in America, and their Japanese was deteriorating. The director agreed enthusiastically. Soon Keiko was teaching a small class of children every Saturday afternoon. She taught them to read hiragana and katakana, to write basic kanji, to understand the grammar and structure of their heritage language. But more than that, she taught them about Japanese culture, traditional stories, customs, the importance of respect and harmony. The work was deeply fulfilling. She wasn't just teaching language, she was helping preserve a culture that the war had tried to erase. She was giving these children a connection to their roots, even as they grew up as Americans. James supported her completely, even though it meant she worked 6 days a week and had less time for household duties. He learned to cook basic meals, did his own laundry, helped clean the apartment. Some of his co-workers teased him about it. What kind of man lets his wife work while he does the cooking? But he ignored them. Keiko is smart and talented, he told one particularly obnoxious colleague. Why would I want her to waste that sitting at home when she could be teaching kids and making a difference? The teaching brought in a little extra money. Not much, as most families could only afford to pay $1 or $2 per child, but every bit helped. More importantly, it brought Keiko a sense of purpose and community. She was contributing something meaningful, using her skills, honoring her heritage while adapting to her new life. In the spring of 1947, Keiko's mother wrote with unexpected news. She had saved enough money to pay for Keiko to visit Japan. The trip would be short, only 2 weeks, but it would be enough for her to see her family, to see what had become of her homeland. Keiko was torn. She desperately wanted to see her family, to embrace her mother, to see her father and brother again. But she was also afraid. Afraid of what she'd find. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of how it would feel to return to Japan as an outsider, as someone who had chosen America and an American husband. James encouraged her to go. They're your family, he said. They need to see that you're okay, and you need to see them. But what about money, the ship ticket? We'll figure it out. Maybe I can pick up some extra shifts. We'll make it work. So Keiko made the journey back across the Pacific, alone this time, traveling as Mrs. Keiko Morrison with an American passport that still felt strange in her hands. Tokyo was unrecognizable. The city she'd known was gone, replaced by a landscape of rubble and makeshift shelters. The Imperial Palace still stood, but all around it were ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. People looked thin and tired, moving through the streets with the weight of defeat visible in every step. Her family's house was gone, destroyed in the firebombing. They were living in a small apartment, 4 people sharing 2 rooms. But when Keiko saw her mother in the doorway, none of that mattered. "Oka-san," she whispered, and then they were both crying, holding each other, years of separation and worry flowing out in tears. Those 2 weeks were intense. Joyful reunions mixed with difficult conversations. Her father was proud but distant, struggling with the fact that his daughter had married an American. Her brother, who had survived the war but lost a hand in the fighting, was bitter about everything and took some of that bitterness out on Keiko. "You live in comfort while we suffer," he said. "You eat well while we starve. You've forgotten what it means to be Japanese." "I haven't forgotten," Keiko replied. "I will never forget. But staying here wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring back what was lost." Her mother was more understanding, especially after Keiko showed her photographs of James and described their life in San Francisco. "He makes you happy?" her mother asked. "Yes, Oka-san. Very happy." "Then I am glad," her mother said, though tears ran down her face. "I wish things were different. I wish you could have had a normal life, married a Japanese man, raised your children here with us. But we live in abnormal times, and if he treats you well, if he loves you, then that is something to be grateful for." Before she left, Keiko's mother gave her a small package. Inside was a kimono, a beautiful silk piece that had somehow survived the firebombing, hidden in a trunk. "For when you have a daughter," her mother said, "so she knows where she comes from." Keiko held the kimono and wept. It was more than a piece of clothing. It was a bridge between her old life and her new one, a blessing from her mother, a piece of home she could carry forward. The journey back to San Francisco felt different from the journey away. This time she was returning to James, to their apartment, to their life together. America wasn't just a place where she'd ended up. It was becoming home. When she saw James waiting at the dock, his face breaking into a huge smile when he spotted her, Keiko felt her heart swell with love and certainty. This was where she belonged. Not because she'd abandoned Japan, but because this was where her future was, where her heart was. They embraced right there on the dock, not caring who saw or what they thought. And for the first time since the war had ended, Keiko felt truly at peace with her choices. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought changes. The world was slowly moving past the war. Relations between America and Japan were improving. The occupation was ending. Japan was beginning to rebuild. For Keiko and James, life improved too. James got another promotion, becoming a supervisor at the shipping company. Keiko expanded her teaching, now working with both children and adults who wanted to learn Japanese. They moved to a better apartment, one with their own bathroom and a small balcony where Keiko could grow herbs and flowers. They talked about having children. It was a scary prospect for bringing mixed-race children into a world that still struggled with prejudice, but also exciting. They wanted to create a family, to raise children who could bridge cultures, who could be both Japanese and American without having to choose. In 1951, their first child was born, a daughter they named Emily Sakura Morrison. Emily for James's grandmother, Sakura for the cherry blossoms Keiko missed from Japan. Holding her daughter for the first time, seeing her mix of features, James's nose, Keiko's eyes, something entirely her own, Keiko felt overwhelmed with love and hope. This child was living proof that love could transcend boundaries, that new beginnings were possible even after terrible conflict. She thought back to that freezing morning on the dock, when a young soldier had given his jacket to a shivering prisoner. How impossible it had seemed then that anything good could come from such a beginning. And yet here she was, holding their daughter, building a life that honored both of their heritages. The jacket, that same olive green military jacket, was folded carefully in a box in their closet. Sometimes Keiko took it out and held it, remembering. Not just the cold or the fear or the uncertainty, but also the hope. The first glimpse of kindness in a world that had forgotten what kindness meant. That jacket had given her more than warmth on a cold morning. It had given her the courage to see beyond enemy lines, beyond racial divides, beyond all the barriers that war had built. It had shown her that love was possible anywhere, even in the most impossible circumstances. And as she rocked her daughter to sleep, singing a soft Japanese lullaby that her own mother had sung to her, Keiko knew that this was the true victory. Not the military kind with tanks and bombs and surrenders, but the human kind with love and understanding and the courage to choose hope over hate. The war had taken so much from so many, but it had also, in its own strange way, given Keiko everything that mattered. A partner who saw her humanity when he could have seen only an enemy. A home in a new land that was slowly accepting her, and a future full of possibility. The jacket was just a jacket in the end, but it represented something far greater. The simple truth that one act of kindness, one moment of choosing compassion over cruelty, could change everything. The transition from prisoner to free woman was harder than Keiko had imagined. Even with James by her side, even with the legal protection of marriage, the reality of building a life in post-war America was overwhelming. Their first apartment was in the Fillmore district, in a building where the landlord was willing to overlook the unusual nature of their marriage in exchange for regular rent payments. The apartment consisted of 2 small rooms, a combined living space and bedroom, and a tiny kitchen with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The bathroom was shared with 3 other apartments on their floor. To Keiko, who had grown up in a traditional Japanese house with tatami mats and sliding doors, the Western-style apartment felt alien. Everything was hard surfaces, wooden floors, plaster walls, metal fixtures. There was no genkin where one could remove shoes, no ofuro for proper bathing, no space for the small household altar she'd grown up with. Money was tight those first months. James's job at the shipping company paid $35 a week, which had to cover rent, food, utilities, and everything else. Keiko's work at the Japanese grocery store brought in another $15 weekly, paid in cash by Mr. Yamamoto, the owner who had himself spent the war years in an internment camp with his family. They learned to budget carefully. Keiko missed Japanese food desperately at first. Real miso soup, fresh sashimi, the rice dishes her mother used to make. But Mr. Yamamoto's store helped. She could buy miso paste, rice, pickled vegetables, dried seaweed. She learned to adapt, creating hybrid dishes that combined Japanese techniques with American ingredients. The discrimination they faced was both subtle and overt. Some landlords refused to rent to them, some store owners served James but ignored Keiko. Children sometimes shouted slurs. Old men who'd lost sons in the Pacific Theater spat at their feet. But there were good moments too. Neighbors who brought them food. A Japanese grocery store owner who gave Keiko a job. The way James's hand always found hers when they walked down the street, a silent message that they were in this together. The language barrier was harder than Keiko had expected. Academic English and everyday American English were very different things. She could read a newspaper article, but struggled with slang, idioms, and the rapid-fire conversations of native speakers. Once at a department store, a saleswoman deliberately gave her wrong change and then mocked her when she tried to point out the error. "Maybe you should learn to count in American, sweetie," the woman said with a nasty smile. Keiko had stood there, her face burning with shame and anger, unable to find the English words to defend herself. When she told James that evening, his face went dark with anger, but she stopped him. "This is my life now. I must learn to handle these things myself." The Japanese community in San Francisco became a refuge. At Mr. Yamamoto's store or at the small Buddhist temple in Japantown, she could speak her native language, could be understood completely, but even there her situation was unusual. Some women were supportive, others judgmental. "You married a Hakujin," one older woman said, using the Japanese word for a white person with disdain. "How can you betray your people like that?" "I didn't betray anyone," Keiko replied quietly. "I fell in love. The war is over." "The war is never over," the woman said. "Not for us." Those words haunted Keiko. Was she betraying her heritage? She talked about it with Sachiko in letters. Her friend had been repatriated to Japan and was living in Tokyo, trying to rebuild her life in the ruins. They made friends slowly, carefully. Other mixed couples who understood their struggles. Progressive activists who believed in integration and equality. Japanese Americans who had come back from the internment camps and were trying to rebuild their lives. One of their closest friends became a couple named Robert and Mary Chen. He was Chinese American, she was white, and they'd faced many of the same challenges. The four of them would gather for potluck dinners, sharing food and stories and the comfort of being understood. "People look at us like we're making a political statement just by existing," Mary said one evening. "Like our marriages are about making some kind of point rather than just loving someone." "Yes," Keiko agreed fervently. "I did not marry James to make statement. I married him because he gave me his jacket when I was cold." Everyone laughed at that, and Keiko realized it had become her standard answer when people asked about their relationship. It was simple, true, and somehow captured everything that mattered. James got a promotion at work, which meant a small raise. Keiko's English improved steadily, and Mr. Yamamoto began trusting her with more responsibilities at the store. They saved a little money each week, dreaming of eventually being able to afford a better apartment, or maybe even a house someday. As Keiko's confidence grew, she began to think about what she wanted to do beyond just surviving. She remembered her dream of becoming a teacher. She approached the director of the Buddhist temple, asking if she could offer Japanese language lessons to the children in the community. Many of them had been born in America, and their Japanese was deteriorating. The director agreed enthusiastically. Soon Keiko was teaching a small class of children every Saturday afternoon. She taught them to read hiragana and katakana, to write basic kanji, to understand grammar. But more than that, she taught them about Japanese culture, traditional stories, customs, the importance of respect and harmony. The work was deeply fulfilling. She wasn't just teaching language, she was helping preserve a culture that the war had tried to erase. She was giving these children a connection to their roots, even as they grew up as Americans. James supported her completely, even though it meant she worked 6 days a week. He learned to cook basic meals, did his own laundry, helped clean the apartment. Some of his co-workers teased him. What kind of man lets his wife work while he does the cooking? But he ignored them. Keiko is smart and talented, he told one particularly obnoxious colleague. Why would I want her to waste that sitting at home when she could be teaching kids and making a difference? The teaching brought in a little extra money and gave Keiko a sense of purpose and community. She was contributing something meaningful, using her skills, honoring her heritage while adapting to her new life. In the spring of 1947, Keiko's mother wrote with unexpected news. She had saved enough money to pay for Keiko to visit Japan. The trip would be short, only 2 weeks, but it would be enough. Keiko was torn. She desperately wanted to see her family, but she was also afraid. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of how it would feel to return to Japan as an outsider, as someone who had chosen America and an American husband. James encouraged her to go. "They're your family, he said. "They need to see that you're okay." Tokyo was unrecognizable. The city she'd known was gone, replaced by rubble and makeshift shelters. Her family's house was destroyed. They were living in a small apartment, 4 people sharing 2 rooms. When she saw her mother in the doorway, none of that mattered. "Oka-san," she whispered, and then they were both crying, holding each other. Those 2 weeks were intense. Her father was proud but distant. Her brother, who had survived the war but lost a hand in the fighting, was bitter. "You live in comfort while we suffer," he said. "You eat well while we starve." Her mother was more understanding. "He makes you happy?" she asked about James. "Yes, Oka-san, very happy." "Then I am glad," her mother said through tears. "I wish things were different. But if he treats you well, if he loves you, then that is something to be grateful for." Before she left, her mother gave her a kimono that had survived the firebombing. "For when you have a daughter," she said. So she knows where she comes from. The journey back to San Francisco felt different. This time she was returning home, to James, to their apartment, to their life together. America wasn't just a place where she'd ended up, it was becoming home. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought changes. James got another promotion. Keiko expanded her teaching. They moved to a better apartment with their own bathroom and a small balcony where Keiko could grow herbs and flowers. They talked about having children. It was scary, bringing mixed-race children into a world that still struggled with prejudice, but also exciting. They wanted to create a family, to raise children who could bridge cultures. In 1951, their first child was born, a daughter they named Emily Sakura Morrison. Emily for James's grandmother, Sakura for the cherry blossoms Keiko missed from Japan. Holding her daughter for the first time, seeing her mix of features, Keiko felt overwhelmed with love and hope. This child was living proof that love could transcend boundaries, that new beginnings were possible. She thought back to that freezing morning on the dock when a young soldier had given his jacket to a shivering prisoner. How impossible it had seemed then that anything good could come from such a beginning. The jacket was folded carefully in a box in their closet. Sometimes Keiko took it out and held it, remembering. Not just the cold or the fear, but the hope. The first glimpse of kindness in a world that had forgotten what kindness meant. As she rocked Emily to sleep, singing a Japanese lullaby her mother had sung to her, Keiko knew this was the true victory. Not the military kind with tanks and bombs, but the human kind with love and understanding and the courage to choose hope over hate. 2 years later, they had a son, Michael Hiroshi Morrison. Then another daughter, Sarah Yuki. Their apartment filled with the sounds of children laughing, speaking both English and Japanese, growing up in a household that celebrated both cultures. Keiko taught her children traditional Japanese customs, how to properly use chopsticks, the importance of removing shoes at the door, respect for elders. James taught them American traditions, Thanksgiving dinners, 4th of July celebrations, baseball games in the park. The children became bridges themselves, moving easily between their two cultures, proving that identity didn't have to be either or. They could be both Japanese and American, honoring both heritages, creating something new and beautiful.